We are living through a moment that most people never thought would arrive. A moment where the rules that govern dating, relationships, and social interaction for decades have quietly collapsed without a dramatic announcement. What looks like a strange headline at first glance is actually a warning sign of something much larger unfolding beneath the surface. Singles events are failing. Online dating is fading, and men across the world are opting out, not in protest, not in anger, but in silence. Stay with me to the very end of this video, because once you see the full picture, it becomes clear that this is not a temporary trend, it is a permanent shift. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share it with people who need to hear this message, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. And select all if you want more angry guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. These conversations are not happening anywhere else with this level of honesty, and staying connected matters. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a clear and structured way. And it is linked in the description of the video. So go check it out now while you are thinking about it. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let us talk about what is really happening, because this story did not begin with a singles event in China where 1,000 women showed up and not a single man attended. That moment was not the cause, it was the result. It was the visible symptom of a shift that has been building quietly for decades, one that most people dismissed, mocked, or denied until it became impossible to ignore. For years, men were told they were the problem. They were told they were unnecessary, outdated, privileged, dangerous, or simply in the way. Entire cultural movements were built around the idea that men needed to be corrected, restrained, or removed from social spaces unless they complied perfectly with constantly changing expectations. And for a long time, men kept trying to adapt, thinking that if they just adjusted their behavior, learned the new rules, or stayed quiet long enough, things would stabilize again. Instead, the rules kept changing. What was acceptable one year became unacceptable the next. What was encouraged one decade became condemned the next. Men were told not to approach women in public, not at work, not at school, not at social gatherings, not at gyms, not at events, and eventually not anywhere at all unless explicitly invited. They were told that initiating conversation was intrusive, that interest was pressure, that attraction was objectification, and that silence was safer. So many men listened. They stepped back, they stopped engaging, they stopped approaching, they stopped attending. And what is happening now is not men refusing to participate out of spite, but men simply continuing to do exactly what they were told to do for decades. Singles events were once marketed as safe, structured spaces where people could meet organically without the chaos of bars or clubs. They were supposed to be neutral ground, low pressure environments designed to help people connect in real life. But over time, these spaces inherited the same social dynamics that poisoned every other part of dating culture. Men were still expected to perform, to initiate, to entertain, to take risks, while women were encouraged to evaluate, filter, and judge. At the same time, the consequences for getting it wrong became more severe. A poorly received joke, an awkward comment, or a misunderstood interaction could now be framed as something far more serious than simple social clumsiness. For many men, the risk stopped being worth the reward. So when reports started coming in that men were no longer attending singles events, people laughed it off. They said it was temporary. They said men would come back. They said it was just a phase. Then it kept happening. In the United States, in Europe, in parts of Asia, attendance skewed heavily female. Organizers tried changing formats, offering incentives, lowering ticket prices, even advertising directly to men. But the response stayed the same. And then came the event in China where over 1,000 women attended and not a single man showed up. That was the moment the laughter stopped. This is not about men hating women. That is the easiest and laziest explanation, and it is also the least accurate. This is about men disengaging from systems that consistently punish them for participation while offering diminishing returns. Men are not staging protests or issuing manifestos. They are not gathering in large groups to complain. They are simply opting out quietly, individually, and permanently. Many have found that their lives are calmer, more predictable, and less stressful without the constant pressure to perform socially under unclear rules. Online dating tells the same story, just with different data points. For years, dating apps promised efficiency, convenience, and choice. What they delivered was an environment where a small percentage of men received most of the attention while the majority were largely ignored. Women were told that abundance equaled empowerment, that endless options meant better outcomes, but over time, many discovered that matches did not translate into dates, and dates did not translate into stable relationships. Men, on the other hand, discovered that endless swiping with minimal response was not just discouraging, but demoralizing. Eventually, many stopped logging in. Others deleted the apps entirely. Some never joined in the first place. Now, women are reporting that men are not responding, not asking them out, not following through, and not showing interest even after matching. This is framed as men being lazy, unmotivated, or emotionally unavailable. But again, that explanation ignores the context. Many men are simply done investing energy into systems that consistently frame them as disposable while demanding effort, resources, and emotional labor in return. When you tell someone repeatedly that they are not wanted, not needed, or not welcome, eventually they believe you. At the same time, economic pressures are tightening. Rent is higher. Food costs more. Inflation eats away at purchasing power. Dual incomes are no longer optional for many households. For decades, the narrative was that independence meant freedom from reliance on men. But now, as living costs rise, that independence comes with a harsh reality. Survival is harder alone. And the quiet truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge is that cooperation between men and women was not just cultural, it was practical. When that cooperation breaks down, everyone feels the strain. What we are witnessing now is not women suddenly becoming desperate for men, but systems revealing their dependencies. Singles events exist because people want connection. Dating apps exist because people want companionship. When one side disengages, the imbalance becomes impossible to hide. And yet, instead of asking why men left, many commentators default to blame. They accuse men of bitterness, immaturity, or entitlement, but blame does not bring people back. It never has. Men who have walked away often describe finding peace in solitude. They focus on work, hobbies, fitness, learning, and financial stability. They build routines that do not revolve around seeking validation or approval. They invest in friendships, often with other men who have made similar choices. This is not isolation in the traditional sense. It is selective engagement. It is choosing environments where expectations are clear and outcomes are predictable. For many, that trade off feels worth it. This does not mean relationships are over or that connection is impossible. It means the old assumptions no longer apply. It means the idea that men will always show up, initiate, and compete regardless of conditions is no longer true. That script has been retired. What replaces it will depend on whether there is a willingness to acknowledge reality without hostility or denial. The uncomfortable truth is that you cannot tell an entire group of people to go away and then act surprised when they do. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. You cannot discourage approach, condemn initiative, and then complain about absence. You cannot build systems that reward disengagement and then criticize those who disengage. Consequences do not require intention. They only require consistency. To understand why this shift is accelerating rather than stabilizing, you have to look at how incentives shape behavior over time. Human beings respond to feedback loops, not slogans. When effort is consistently met with friction, uncertainty, or punishment, effort eventually stops. For decades, men were told that dating and relationships were worth the struggle, that perseverance would be rewarded, that confidence and resilience would eventually pay off. But what happens when the feedback loop breaks? What happens when effort no longer leads to clarity or connection, but instead leads to confusion, criticism, or silence? At some point, rational people reassess where they place their energy. This is not ideology, it is adaptation. A large number of men did not wake up one day and decide to disengage. It happened slowly. First, they stopped approaching strangers. Then they stopped using dating apps. Then they stopped attending social events where romantic interaction was implied. Eventually, they stopped expecting romantic outcomes at all. What replaced those expectations was not anger, but neutrality. Many men describe feeling invisible long before they decided to walk away. The difference now is that they have embraced that invisibility as freedom rather than failure. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable for people who want simple villains. A man who is angry can be argued with, a man who is disengaged cannot. You cannot shame someone who no longer seeks approval. You cannot pressure someone who has accepted solitude as a valid outcome. This is why so many responses to this phenomenon feel hollow. They are aimed at provoking emotional reactions that no longer exist. Calling men names does not bring them back. Questioning their masculinity does not bring them back. Suggesting they are missing out does not bring them back. Those tools only work on people who still care. Singles events failing is not about poor marketing or bad timing. It is about trust. Trust that participation will be safe, fair, and worthwhile. For many men, that trust is gone. They do not believe that showing up will lead to connection. They do not believe that effort will be appreciated. They do not believe that mistakes will be treated with grace. And without trust, no incentive package works. Free drinks, discounted tickets, or promises of balanced attendance do not overcome years of negative reinforcement. When women attending these events are often genuinely confused. Many were told that if men disappeared, women would thrive independently. They were told that men were replaceable, that technology and community would fill the gaps. What they were not told was that social systems depend on participation from both sides. They were not told that removing one group's incentive to engage would eventually hollow out the entire structure. Now, many are confronting a reality they were never prepared for, where the social spaces designed to connect them feel empty and unresponsive. Online dating platforms provide another clear example. These systems are optimized for engagement, not outcomes. They thrive on keeping users swiping, not pairing them off permanently. Over time, men realized that the system rewarded a small number of profiles while ignoring the rest. Many men felt like background noise in a marketplace that treated attention as currency. The result was predictable. Participation dropped, quality declined, trust eroded. Women now report that even when they match, conversations fade quickly or never lead to real world interaction. This is not because men suddenly forgot how to date. It is because many stopped believing the system was worth investing in. Economic pressure adds another layer to this story. When living costs rise, people become more selective about where they spend their time and money. Dating is not free. It requires emotional energy, financial resources, and risk tolerance. In a world where stability feels fragile, many men choose to invest in areas with clearer returns. Work, skills, fitness, and personal projects offer measurable progress. Dating, under current conditions, often does not. That calculation is not romantic, but it is rational. There is also a generational component that is often ignored. Younger men grew up watching older men navigate relationships that ended poorly, often at great personal cost. They saw financial loss, emotional exhaustion, and social isolation. They listened to warnings that were dismissed as bitterness by others, but taken seriously by those paying attention. Many younger men internalized the lesson that caution was not weakness, but wisdom. They entered adulthood already skeptical of narratives that promise fulfillment without acknowledging risk. This skepticism is not limited to romantic relationships, it extends to institutions, media narratives, and social expectations. Trust has been eroded across the board. When people feel that systems are not designed with their well being in mind, disengagement becomes a form of self preservation. Walking away is not rebellion, it is retreat. It is choosing stability over uncertainty. And once people build lives that function without certain systems, they rarely return voluntarily. What makes this moment particularly striking is how quiet it is. There are no mass protests. There are no viral manifestos. There is no coordinated movement with leaders and slogans. There is simply absence, empty seats at events, inactive profiles, unanswered messages, silence where participation used to be. Silence is harder to argue with than noise. It does not provoke debate, it forces observation. Some will argue that this is temporary, that demographics or economic shifts will force a return to old patterns. That assumption relies on the idea that people revert to tradition under pressure. But history shows that once new norms form, they tend to persist. Men who have built routines around solitude, autonomy, and selective engagement do not suddenly abandon those structures because someone tells them they should want more. Desire cannot be mandated. Participation cannot be coerced without consequences. Others will claim that technology will fix the problem, that better algorithms or new platforms will restore balance. Technology can facilitate connection, but it cannot restore trust. Trust is built through consistent, fair treatment over time. It is lost quickly and regained slowly. No app update can undo years of cultural messaging that framed one group as problematic by default. This brings us to the hardest part of the conversation: accountability, not blame, but responsibility. Systems are shaped by incentives, narratives, and norms. When those elements discourage participation from one side, the outcome is predictable. Acknowledging this does not require abandoning values or returning to outdated roles. It requires honesty about cause and effect. It requires recognizing that respect must be mutual and that engagement cannot be demanded without offering safety, clarity, and appreciation in return. For men who have walked away, the conversation often feels irrelevant. They are not waiting for apologies or reforms. Many have already adjusted their expectations downward and found contentment there. They are not hostile to connection, but they are no longer searching for it. If it happens organically, on their terms, in environments that feel safe and reciprocal, they may engage. If not, they are prepared to continue as they are. For women facing empty rooms and unresponsive matches, the experience can feel destabilizing. The scripts they were given no longer work. The assumptions they relied on no longer hold. This can lead to frustration, anger, or denial. But it can also lead to reflection. Reflection is uncomfortable because it requires questioning narratives that once felt empowering. It requires asking whether independence was framed honestly or whether trade offs were minimized for the sake of ideology. None of this means cooperation is impossible. It means cooperation must be renegotiated. Old expectations cannot simply be reactivated. Trust must be rebuilt slowly through consistent behavior rather than messaging. That process it takes time, humility, and patience. It cannot be rushed and it cannot be forced. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will come back to singles events or dating apps. The question is what kind of social structures will emerge to replace what no longer works. Will new forms of connection develop that prioritize mutual respect and clarity? Or will fragmentation deepen, with more people choosing isolation over uncertainty? The answer depends on whether reality is acknowledged or resisted. This moment is a mirror. It reflects the cumulative impact of decades of messaging, incentives, and choices. Mirrors do not judge, they simply show what is there. The image may be uncomfortable, but turning away does not change it. Only action does. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire shift is the assumption that men walking away are doing so because they failed or because they could not compete. That explanation is comforting because it preserves the belief that the system itself is sound and only individuals are deficient. But when you look closely at the pattern, it becomes clear that many of the men who disengaged were not excluded, they opted out. They were employed, functional, socially capable, and in many cases had previous relationship experience. Their withdrawal was not driven by inability, but by evaluation. They assessed the environment and decided the cost outweighed the benefit. This distinction matters because it changes how the situation can be addressed, if it can be addressed at all. You can motivate someone who wants to succeed but lacks opportunity. You cannot motivate someone who has already decided the game is not worth playing. The latter has moved beyond persuasion. That is why campaigns urging men to return to dating spaces feel ineffective. They are speaking to an audience that has already tuned out. Another overlooked factor is how men process social feedback differently once they stop seeking validation. Many men describe a moment where the pressure lifted, the constant second guessing, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the anxiety of misinterpretation, all faded once they stopped trying to engage romantically. This relief is not temporary. It reinforces the decision to disengage. Once peace becomes associated with distance, returning to the source of stress feels irrational. Cultural messaging plays a significant role here. For years, narratives emphasized that men needed to change, to listen more, to do better, to step aside. Some of those messages were valid and necessary. Others were vague, contradictory, or framed in a way that implied inherent fault rather than specific behavior. Over time, many men internalized the idea that participation itself was risky. When every interaction feels like walking through a field of invisible tripwires, avoidance becomes a reasonable strategy. At the same time, many women were encouraged to view boundaries as empowerment without being taught how boundaries affect engagement. Boundaries are essential, but they do not exist in a vacuum. Every boundary shapes behavior. When boundaries multiply without corresponding clarity or invitation, they do not just protect, they repel. This does not make them wrong, but it does make their consequences predictable. Reduced approach leads to reduced interaction. Reduced interaction leads to isolation. This is not punishment, it is physics. The singles events that now struggle to attract men are operating on outdated assumptions. They assume men are eager for structured opportunities to meet women. They assume men are motivated by novelty and potential. They assume that removing alcohol or adding rules creates safety without cost. What they fail to account for is emotional fatigue. Many men are tired of environments where they are expected to lead while being treated as liabilities. They are tired of being evaluated without being understood. They are tired of being told to show up and then criticized for how they show up. In China, the example of large scale singles events with no male attendance shocked observers because it disrupted the idea that cultural differences would prevent this outcome. But the forces at work are not limited by geography. Economic pressure, social media influence, and globalized narratives have created similar conditions across very different societies. Men everywhere are exposed to the same stories, the same warnings, the same cautionary examples. They learn from each other's experiences, even if they never speak directly. Another element often ignored is how social spaces have changed. Many public environments that once facilitated casual interaction are now governed by unspoken rules and surveillance. Phones record, comments are shared, moments are clipped out of context. A single awkward exchange can be immortalized online. For men who value privacy and reputation, this adds another layer of risk. Opting out is not cowardice, it is damage control. Meanwhile, many women are experiencing a different kind of shock. They were told that removing men from the center of social life would increase freedom. What they are discovering is that absence does not automatically create fulfillment. Freedom without connection can feel empty. Independence without cooperation can feel heavy. These realizations are not failures, they are corrections. But corrections are painful when they contradict years of reinforcement. And this is where conversations often derail into defensiveness. Instead of examining how incentives and messaging shaped outcomes, discussions collapse into accusation. Men are accused of being selfish. Women are accused of being entitled. These labels accomplish nothing. They obscure the structural dynamics at play and reduce complex feedback loops into moral judgments. Moral judgments do not rebuild systems, they harden positions. The truth is that many people on both sides acted according to the information they were given. Men were told to withdraw, to avoid, to focus on themselves. Women were told they did not need men, that men would adapt regardless. Both messages contained partial truths and significant omissions. Now, those omissions are visible. One of the most striking developments is how many men express indifference rather than resentment when asked about dating. Indifference is not the same as bitterness. Bitterness seeks acknowledgement, indifference does not. It is the emotional equivalent of closing a book and putting it back on the shelf. This is why appeals that rely on guilt or obligation fail. Obligation only motivates those who still feel responsible. The broader implication of this trend extends beyond dating. Social cohesion relies on voluntary participation. When large groups disengage, institutions weaken, community events shrink, informal networks dissolve. This has downstream effects on mental health, family formation, and economic stability. None of this happens overnight. It unfolds slowly, quietly, until it becomes normal. Some argue that men will eventually return because biology or loneliness will force their hand. That argument assumes that loneliness is worse than the stress they associate with engagement. For many, it is not. Solitude can be structured, stress is chaotic. Given the choice, people often choose predictability over intensity. Others suggest that women will adapt by changing expectations. That may happen in some cases, but adaptation requires consensus and trust. It requires signaling that effort will be met with appreciation rather than suspicion. It requires environments where mistakes are treated as learning moments rather than moral failures. These conditions cannot be declared. They must be demonstrated consistently over time. What is rarely discussed is how much repair work is required once disengagement reaches the scale. Trust does not reset automatically, it accumulates slowly through repeated positive interactions. When those interactions stop entirely, there is nothing to build on. Restarting requires patience that many do not have and humility that few are encouraged to practice. Another complicating factor is that many men who have walked away are not unhappy. This undermines narratives that frame disengagement as pathology. When people are content, they are less susceptible to pressure. They are less likely to respond to fear based messaging. This makes reversal even less likely. We also need to talk about how public discourse treats male withdrawal as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be understood. When people are framed as defective for opting out, it reinforces the very dynamics that drove them away. Respect cannot be demanded from a position of dismissal. Engagement cannot be restored through contempt. This moment requires something that is currently in short supply: patience. Not performative patience, but real patience. The willingness to let silence exist without filling it with blame. The willingness to observe outcomes without rushing to assign fault. The willingness to admit that some strategies failed and that good intentions do not guarantee good results. None of this guarantees reconciliation or renewed participation. It simply creates the conditions where participation could become appealing again. Without those conditions, absence will continue to feel like the safest option for many. As we move deeper into this shift, it becomes clear that nostalgia will not fix it. Longing for how things used to be ignores why changed. The past cannot be reinstalled like old software. Any future system will have to account for the lessons learned during this period of disengagement. The uncomfortable possibility is that this is not a crisis, but an equilibrium, a new normal, where fewer people pursue traditional relationships, where solitude is normalized, and where connection becomes more selective and intentional. Whether that is good or bad depends on perspective. What matters is recognizing it for what it is. We are not watching men disappear. We are watching men choose differently. Choice is the key word. When choice is exercised at scale, it reshapes systems. Ignoring that reality does not reverse it. As this pattern continues, what becomes increasingly clear is that the discussion around men disengaging often focuses on surface level explanations because deeper analysis threatens too many assumptions. It is easier to say men are confused, bitter, or immature than to admit that large scale social incentives changed and people responded accordingly. Systems do not collapse because of a single decision. They erode when participation no longer feels safe, meaningful, or rewarding. Once that erosion reaches a certain point, rebuilding becomes far more difficult than most expect. Many people underestimate how much emotional discipline it takes for men to disengage without lashing out. The expectation was that men would respond with anger, protest, or confrontation. Instead, many responded with quiet withdrawal. That response confused observers because it did not fit the script. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, just an increasing absence that slowly revealed itself in empty rooms, shrinking attendance, and unanswered messages. One of the reasons this absence feels so destabilizing is because modern dating culture relied heavily on men initiating movement. Men asked, men approached, men escalated, men took risks. When that engine shuts off, the system does not simply rebalance on its own, it stalls. The expectation that men would always fill that role, regardless of conditions, was never sustainable, but it persisted because it went unchallenged for so long. Another issue rarely discussed is how male withdrawal has been framed as a social failure rather than a rational boundary. Boundaries are celebrated when set by one group and criticized when set by another. This double standard erodes credibility. If people are encouraged to protect their mental health, prioritize peace, and avoid harmful environments, those principles cannot suddenly be dismissed when men apply them. Consistency matters. Without it, messaging loses authority. At the individual level, many men report that disengagement allowed them to see themselves more clearly. Without constant comparison or external validation, they developed internal metrics for success. Progress became personal rather than performative. Goals became practical rather than symbolic. This shift reduced anxiety and increased self respect. Once people experience that internal alignment, returning to environments that disrupt it feels unnecessary. This is why appeals framed around obligation fall flat. Obligation implies debt. Debt implies imbalance. Many men feel they have already paid enough in emotional effort, financial cost, and reputational risk. Asking them to re enter the same dynamics without structural change feels like asking them to repeat a mistake. Women navigating this new reality often experience conflicting emotions. Some feel frustration that effort no longer yields the same response. Others feel confusion because they followed the guidance they were given and still ended up dissatisfied. These reactions are understandable. Being told one story and living another creates cognitive dissonance. But dissonance cannot be resolved by demanding that others behave differently. It can only be resolved by updating expectations. A critical factor here is how long it takes for cultural messaging to update. Narratives often lag behind reality. By the time consequences appear, the messaging that caused them is already deeply embedded. People defend narratives not because they work, but because abandoning them feels like admitting error. That emotional resistance slows adaptation. This is particularly visible in media coverage of declining male participation in dating spaces. Articles frame the issue as a mystery or anomaly rather than a predictable outcome. They ask where the men went without acknowledging how often men were told to leave. This selective amnesia prevents honest dialogue. You cannot solve a problem while refusing to name its causes. There is also a tendency to overcorrect by romanticizing the past. Some argue that returning to older social structures would fix the issue, but the past had its own flaws, many of which prompted the changes that led us here. Progress and correction are not opposites. The challenge is finding balance without swinging between extremes. One reason balance has been elusive is that modern discourse rewards certainty over nuance. Platforms amplify strong opinions, not careful analysis. This environment discourages reflection. It encourages taking sides rather than understanding systems. But systems do not care about sides, they respond to incentives. Another underappreciated dynamic is how male disengagement affects female expectations over time. When fewer men participate, competition dynamics shift. Scarcity changes behavior. Some respond by doubling down on existing strategies. Others reconsider what they value and what they are willing to compromise on. Neither response is inherently right or wrong, but both signal adjustment under pressure. The danger lies in interpreting scarcity as entitlement rather than feedback. Scarcity does not mean something is owed, it means conditions have changed. Adapting requires acknowledging that change rather than resisting it. Resistance often manifests as blame, but blame does not alter incentives. From a broader social perspective, the normalization of male withdrawal raises questions about how communities will function. Informal social glue often relies on casual interaction. When people avoid those spaces, cohesion weakens. This has implications for everything from local events to workplace culture. The effects ripple outward, often unnoticed, until they become disruptive. At the same time, it is important not to catastrophize. Human beings are adaptable. New forms of connection may emerge that do not resemble traditional dating at all. Smaller, more intentional networks may replace large, impersonal systems. Trust may rebuild slowly through shared projects, values, or goals rather than superficial attraction. These possibilities exist, but they require space to develop without pressure. Pressure is the enemy of genuine engagement. When people feel coerced, they resist. When they feel respected, they consider. This applies universally. The more male disengagement is framed as a problem to be fixed rather than a signal to be understood, the longer it will persist. There is also an economic dimension that cannot be ignored. When people delay or avoid relationships, consumption patterns change, housing choices shift, spending priorities evolve. Industries built around dating, weddings, and family formation feel the impact. These industries often respond with marketing rather than introspection. But marketing cannot compensate for lost trust. One of the most telling signs that this shift is durable is how little effort many men make to explain themselves. They do not feel the need to justify their choice. They are not lobbying for validation. Silence indicates resolution. People who are undecided argue. People who are settled move on. This silence frustrates commentators because it offers no leverage. There is no debate to win, no argument to refute, just an absence that speaks for itself. Absence is powerful because it forces systems to confront their own fragility. It is worth noting that not all men disengage for the same reasons. Some leave due to personal experiences, others due to observation. Some are motivated by principle, others by fatigue. What unites them is not ideology, but outcome. They all found that disengagement improved their quality of life under current conditions. This diversity of motivation makes re engagement even harder. There is no single issue to address, no single reform that would reverse the trend. Any meaningful change would need to operate across cultural, economic, and social dimensions simultaneously. That level of coordination is rare. What is more likely is gradual normalization. Over time, expectations adjust downward. People stop assuming participation. Absence becomes unremarkable. Systems shrink to fit reduced engagement. This is how transitions usually occur, quietly, unevenly, and without a clear endpoint. The question then becomes how individuals navigate this environment without resentment or despair. The answer lies in agency. People who adapt successfully focus on what they can control. They build fulfilling lives regardless of broader trends. They form connections where possible and accept solitude where necessary. They avoid framing their happiness as dependent on systems they do not control. This approach does not negate the desire for connection, it contextualizes it. Connection becomes a bonus rather than a requirement. That shift alone reduces pressure and increases authenticity. When people no longer feel desperate, they engage more honestly. Ironically, this may be the soil from which healthier connections eventually grow. For now, though, we are in a transitional phase. Old systems no longer function as intended. New systems have not fully formed. This liminal space is uncomfortable. It invites projection, fear, and overreaction. But it also invites creativity and reflection for those willing to sit with uncertainty. At this stage of the shift, something subtle but important is happening beneath the surface. The absence of men from dating spaces is no longer shocking to those paying attention. It is becoming expected. Expectations shape behavior. And when people stop expecting men to show up, they begin to organize their lives differently. This is how cultural change solidifies, not through declarations, but through quiet adjustments that compound over time until the old patterns feel distant and unfamiliar. What complicates this adjustment is that many people still operate under outdated assumptions while living in a changed environment. They expect outcomes that no longer align with current incentives. When those outcomes fail to materialize, frustration grows. Frustration seeks an outlet, and without a clear cause that feels safe to acknowledge, it often turns into generalized blame. This cycle repeats, producing more heat than light. A major reason this transition feels unresolved is because modern culture struggles with ambiguity. There is a desire for clear villains and clear solutions, but ambiguity is uncomfortable because it requires sitting with uncertainty. Male disengagement does not offer the satisfaction of a clear enemy, it offers a mirror. And mirrors are unsettling because they reflect patterns rather than intentions. One of the patterns that becomes visible when you step back is how often effort was decoupled from reward. For a long time, men were encouraged to invest heavily in dating while being told that outcomes were not guaranteed and expectations should be minimal. That imbalance created a situation where effort became symbolic rather than practical. People can sustain symbolic effort only so long before asking what it actually produces. When the answer is stress, confusion, or indifference, withdrawal becomes a rational response. Another pattern is how quickly disengagement spreads once it becomes normalized. People observe outcomes in others and adjust preemptively. A man does not need a negative experience of his own to decide that participation is risky. He only needs to see enough examples. Stories travel faster than lessons. Observation often replaces experimentation. This accelerates disengagement in a way that surprises those who assume experience is the primary driver. This observational learning is amplified by online communities. Men share experiences, not always to complain, but to compare notes. Over time, a consensus forms around what feels worth pursuing and what does not. When enough people reach the same conclusion independently, it reinforces the decision. This is not coordination, it is convergence. Women experience a similar process from a different angle. As engagement declines, they compare notes as well. They notice patterns of unresponsiveness, shorter conversations, fewer invitations. Some interpret this as personal rejection. Others see it as a broader shift. How one interprets it shapes the response. Personalizing systemic change creates resentment. Contextualizing it creates clarity. Clarity, however, requires letting go of comforting myths. One such myth is that independence eliminates interdependence. Independence can reduce reliance, but it does not remove the human need for cooperation. Cooperation is not weakness, it is efficiency. Societies that forget this often relearn it the hard way through friction rather than reflection. Another myth is that attraction alone sustains engagement. Attraction initiates interest, but trust sustains participation. Trust requires predictability, fairness, and mutual respect. When these elements are inconsistent, attraction fades quickly. Many men discovered that attraction without trust felt hollow. They chose to avoid the cycle altogether. This leads to a deeper question about how modern society defines success and fulfillment. For years, fulfillment was tied to milestones like relationships, marriage, and family formation. As those milestones become less accessible or less appealing under current conditions, people redefine fulfillment. For some men, fulfillment now looks like stability, autonomy, and peace. These values are quieter than traditional milestones, but no less valid. The challenge is that social recognition lags behind personal adaptation. People who choose unconventional paths often face misunderstanding, but misunderstanding loses its power when people are content. Contentment is resilient, it does not require external validation. This is why disengagement persists even in the face of criticism. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to suggest that disengagement has no cost. Reduced connection can lead to loneliness for some. It can limit emotional growth. It can narrow experience. But many men weigh these costs against the perceived risks of engagement and decide the trade off is acceptable. This calculus may change for individuals over time, but the broader trend reflects aggregated decisions, not isolated moods. Another aspect rarely addressed is how early socialization influences later disengagement. Younger men who grow up observing cautionary tales internalize restraint as maturity. They do not experience disengagement as loss because they never fully invested to begin with. Their baseline expectations are lower. This generational reset makes reversal even less likely. Reversal would require not only changing incentives, but also rebuilding narratives that make engagement feel worthwhile. Narratives shape motivation. When narratives emphasize danger, liability, or inadequacy, motivation collapses. When narratives emphasize mutual benefit and shared responsibility, motivation can recover. But narratives cannot contradict lived experience without losing credibility. Credibility is the currency of influence. Once it is depleted, messaging becomes noise. Many attempts to encourage men back into dating spaces fail because they rely on rhetoric rather than reform. Rhetoric without reform feels manipulative. Reform without rhetoric feels organic. People respond to what they experience, not what they are told. This is why small scale, organic connections still occur even as large systems fail. People meet through shared interests, work, or community projects. These environments feel safer because expectations are clearer and stakes are lower. There is no implicit demand for performance. Interaction unfolds naturally. This suggests that connection has not disappeared. It has simply migrated away from formalized systems that no longer inspire trust. However, migration creates uneven access. Not everyone has equal opportunity to participate in organic networks. This can exacerbate inequality and isolation. Addressing this requires thoughtful community design, not pressure campaigns. It requires spaces that encourage interaction without imposing roles or expectations that trigger withdrawal. Another consequence of prolonged disengagement is how it reshapes communication styles. People become more guarded, they share less upfront, they take longer to trust. This caution can be healthy, but it can also slow connection. The balance between openness and protection becomes harder to strike when trust has been eroded collectively. Despite these challenges, moments of reconnection still occur. They tend to be quieter, more intentional, and less performative. They lack the drama often associated with dating culture. This may not satisfy those who crave excitement, but it appeals to those who value stability. Over time, this preference could redefine what connection looks like. What remains unresolved is how institutions respond. Many are ill equipped to adapt because their models depend on scale. Scale requires participation. Participation requires trust. Trust requires consistency. This chain is difficult to repair once broken. Some institutions will adapt, others will fade. This is not failure, it is evolution. The key lesson in all of this is that human behavior follows incentives more reliably than ideals. Ideals inspire, but incentives sustain. When incentives misalign with ideals, behavior changes. Recognizing this does not require abandoning ideals, it requires aligning them with reality. As individuals navigate this landscape, the most constructive approach is curiosity rather than judgment. Asking why patterns emerge is more useful than condemning them. Understanding does not mean agreement, it means accuracy. Accuracy is the foundation of any meaningful response. And this moment will likely be studied years from now as a turning point in social dynamics, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Quiet shifts often have the longest lasting effects because they change defaults rather than rules. Defaults shape behavior more powerfully than mandates. We are nearing the point where disengagement is no longer reactive, but generative. It is producing new norms, new expectations, and new definitions of fulfillment. Whether these developments lead to healthier outcomes depends on how thoughtfully they are navigated. As disengagement settles into the background of everyday life, something else begins to happen that few anticipated. The emotional temperature of social spaces changes. When expectations drop, so does tension. When people stop anticipating certain behaviors, they stop interpreting their absence as personal rejection. This adjustment does not happen overnight, but over time, it reshapes how people relate to one another. Interactions become more cautious, more transactional in some cases, but also more honest in others. The fantasy layer peels away, leaving something quieter and more grounded beneath it. This quieter environment is often mistaken for decline, but decline implies decay without replacement. What we are seeing instead is substitution. Large performative systems lose relevance while smaller, more contained systems gain importance. People invest more deeply in fewer connections rather than spreading energy across many weak ones. This is not necessarily worse, it is different. And difference often feels threatening before it feels familiar. One of the reasons this shift feels uncomfortable is because it disrupts identity narratives. For many people, identity was tied to being chosen, desired, or pursued. When pursuit fades, identity must be reconstructed. That process is unsettling because it forces introspection. It asks questions that were previously answered by external validation. Who am I without attention? What do I value when approval is not guaranteed? These questions do not have quick answers, but they are not harmful. They are developmental. Men who have disengaged often report that this identity reconstruction was difficult at first, but stabilizing over time. Without the constant feedback loop of pursuit and rejection, they recalibrated their sense of worth. Achievement became internal rather than comparative. Progress became cumulative rather than episodic. This shift does not eliminate desire for connection, but it places it in context rather than at the center. Women navigating the same environment face a different set of adjustments. Many were encouraged to equate attention with empowerment. When attention declines, empowerment must be redefined. This does not mean empowerment disappears. It means it becomes less performative and more structural. Agency shifts from being seen to being secure. That transition is rarely discussed because it lacks spectacle, but it is significant. A major obstacle to navigating this transition smoothly is how poorly modern discourse handles trade offs. Every choice has a cost, every gain comes with a loss. For years, conversations emphasized benefits while minimizing costs. Independence was framed as pure upside, engagement was framed as optional. But when costs emerge later, they feel unfair rather than expected. Acknowledging trade offs early would have allowed for more informed decisions, ignoring them delayed reckoning. This delay created a lag between behavior and consequence. People continued to act on outdated assumptions while conditions changed underneath them. When reality finally asserted itself, the adjustment felt abrupt. In truth, it was gradual. It just went unnoticed until it crossed a threshold. And thresholds are important because they mark points of no easy return. Once participation drops below a certain level, systems cannot self correct. They require intentional redesign. Many dating platforms and social organizers are now confronting this reality. Their models assumed a steady supply of male participation. When that assumption fails, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Redesign is difficult because it requires acknowledging failure. Failure is stigmatized, especially when intentions were good. But intention does not negate outcome. Systems must be evaluated by what they produce, not what they promise. This principle applies universally, not just in dating culture. Another dimension of the shift is how it intersects with work and productivity. Many men redirected energy once spent on dating into career development. This increased focus often led to financial stability, which reinforced the decision to disengage. Stability becomes addictive once experienced. It creates a buffer against chaos. Giving that up for uncertain outcomes feels irresponsible to many. This is not about avoiding responsibility, it is about choosing where responsibility is placed. Men who disengaged did not stop being responsible. They simply redirected responsibility inward rather than outward. They became responsible for their own peace, routines, and progress. That internal locus of control is difficult to reverse once established. Meanwhile, women facing economic pressure without the expectation of partnership experience a different kind of responsibility. Costs that were once shared are now borne individually. This reality reframes conversations about independence. Independence does not mean isolation, it means capacity. Capacity requires resources. When resources are strained, cooperation becomes attractive again. But attraction alone does not rebuild trust. Trust rebuilding requires consistent signals over time, not declarations, not campaigns. Signals. Signals are conveyed through behavior, through how mistakes are handled, through whether effort is met with appreciation or suspicion, through whether boundaries are paired with invitation. These details matter more than slogans. One reason rebuilding feels slow is because people are tired. Fatigue reduces patience, it narrows perspective, it makes compromise feel like loss. Many people on both sides are emotionally exhausted from years of tension, debate, and unmet expectations. Exhaustion does not inspire experimentation. It inspires caution. Caution is not inherently bad, it protects against harm. But when caution becomes default, exploration declines. This is the tension at the heart of the current moment: safety versus openness, stability versus connection. Neither side is wrong. The challenge is integrating them without collapsing into extremes. The narrative that men walking away are punishing women is misleading. Punishment implies intent to harm. Most disengagement lacks that intent. It is self directed. People are not thinking about what others will lose, they are thinking about what they will preserve: peace, time, energy, predictability. These are powerful motivators. Likewise, the narrative that women seeking renewed connection are desperate is equally misleading. Seeking connection under new conditions is not desperation, it is adaptation. The problem arises when adaptation is framed as entitlement rather than adjustment. Entitlement resists feedback, adjustment incorporates it. Feedback is neutral, it simply reports outcomes. When participation drops, that is feedback. When events fail, that is feedback. When conversations stall, that is feedback. Interpreting feedback emotionally does not change it. Responding to it structurally might. Structural responses require asking uncomfortable questions. Are the environments welcoming or adversarial? Are expectations explicit or implicit? Are risks shared or uneven? Are mistakes tolerated or punished? These questions do not assign blame, they identify friction. Friction slows movement. Too much friction stops it entirely. Many modern dating systems accumulated friction incrementally until movement ceased. Removing friction requires intentional design, not moral argument. Another overlooked element is how disengagement changes time horizons. People stop planning around long term partnership and start planning around self sufficiency. This affects everything from housing choices to career moves. Once plans are made, reversing them becomes costly. Path dependence sets in. Early choices constrain later options. This path dependence explains why, even if conditions improve, Participation may not rebound quickly. People have already built lives that function without certain assumptions. Change would require reconfiguration. Reconfiguration requires motivation strong enough to justify disruption. That motivation is currently scarce. Some argue that crises will force reconnection, that economic hardship will drive cooperation. History shows mixed outcomes. Hardship can unite or divide depending on trust levels. When trust is low, hardship often accelerates fragmentation. Cooperation under pressure requires pre existing goodwill. That goodwill has been eroded. Rebuilding goodwill is slow work. It cannot be outsourced to institutions alone. It happens through individual interactions that accumulate into patterns. Those interactions are currently limited. This creates a paradox. Goodwill requires interaction. Interaction requires trust. Trust requires goodwill. Breaking that loop is challenging. Despite this, small examples of successful interaction still exist. They often occur in contexts unrelated to dating, volunteering, collaborative projects, skill based communities. These environments shift focus away from evaluation toward contribution. People are valued for what they bring, not how they perform socially. This reduces anxiety and builds rapport organically. These examples suggest a possible path forward, not a return to old dating systems, but the emergence of new social ecosystems where connection is a byproduct rather than the primary objective. This would require patience and a willingness to let relationships develop slowly. Speed has been a major source of distortion. Expectations accelerated faster than trust could keep up. Slowing down is countercultural in an environment optimized for instant feedback, but slowness may be necessary for repair. Repair is delicate, rushing it causes further damage. This applies to relationships, institutions, and narratives alike. As people adjust to this slower pace, some will feel left behind. Not everyone thrives without clear scripts. Ambiguity can be liberating for some and paralyzing for others. Support systems need to adapt accordingly. Community cannot rely solely on romantic structures. Friendship, mentorship, and shared purpose become more important. This diversification of connection may ultimately prove healthier. When emotional needs are spread across multiple relationships rather than concentrated in one, resilience increases. But this requires cultural validation. Currently, many non romantic bonds are undervalued. Elevating them would reduce pressure on dating systems to fulfill every need. Pressure distorts behavior. When dating is expected to deliver identity, validation, stability, and fulfillment, it collapses under its own weight. Reducing that pressure could make participation less risky and more genuine. But reducing pressure requires letting go of certain expectations. Letting go is difficult when expectations are tied to identity. Identity work is personal. No one can do it for someone else. This is why broad solutions often fail. They ignore individual readiness. Some people are prepared to adapt, others are not. Systems must accommodate both without forcing alignment. We are now deep into a reconfiguration period. Outcomes are uncertain, but uncertainty does not equal failure. It signals transition. Transitions are uncomfortable because they lack clear endpoints, but they also create space for recalibration. As this recalibration continues, it will reward those who can tolerate ambiguity without rushing to judgment, those who observe patterns rather than projecting narratives, those who adapt without resentment. These traits are not evenly distributed, but they are learnable. As we reach the final stage of this discussion, it is important to zoom out one last time and look at what this moment actually represents. This is not a collapse of relationships, nor is it a victory for one side over another. It is the end of an era defined by assumptions that were never questioned because they seemed permanent. Permanence creates complacency. When people believe something will always be there, they stopped tending to it. What we are seeing now is what happens when neglected systems finally reflect the accumulated weight of years of imbalance. The men who walked away did not do so in unison, and they did not do so with celebration. Most did not even announce it. They simply adjusted their behavior one decision at a time. One less app, one less event, one less attempt. Each decision felt small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. Patterns, not declarations, shape reality. By the time the pattern became visible, it was already established. For many men, the turning point was not a dramatic incident, but a quiet realization. A realization that effort was expected, but appreciation was rare. That risk was normalized, but protection was not reciprocal. That mistakes were treated as moral failures rather than human errors. When those realizations stacked up, disengagement became less of a protest and more of a conclusion. What is difficult for many observers to accept is that conclusions do not require permission. People do not need consensus to change their behavior. They need only sufficient internal justification. Once that threshold is crossed, external pressure loses influence. This is why calling men back, shaming them back, or warning them about future regret has had little effect. Those strategies assume hesitation. In many cases, hesitation is gone. At the same time, women confronting empty spaces are not villains in this story. They are participants in a system that promised outcomes it could not deliver indefinitely. Many were told that removing men from the center of social life would have no downside. That promise was incomplete. Cooperation is not obsolete simply because autonomy is possible. The human need for shared effort did not disappear. It was deferred. Deferred costs always arrive eventually. They do not announce themselves politely. They surface as confusion, frustration, and unmet expectations. That does not mean the original goals were wrong. It means the implementation ignored trade offs. Trade offs do not disappear. When they are ignored, they compound. One of the most important lessons of this entire shift is that social systems are fragile when they rely on one side to absorb most of the risk. Risk must be shared to be sustainable. When risk concentrates, withdrawal follows. This principle applies beyond dating. It applies to workplaces, communities, and institutions. Balance is not a slogan, it is a structural requirement. Another lesson is that silence is feedback. When people stop showing up, that is information. Treating absence as hostility misses the point. Absence is a response to conditions, not a declaration of intent. Listening to silence requires humility because it cannot be debated. It can only be interpreted honestly or dismissed reflexively. Dismissal preserves ego, but sacrifices understanding. Understanding does not guarantee reconciliation. It simply opens the possibility. Possibility depends on willingness. Willingness depends on trust. Trust depends on consistency. This chain cannot be skipped. There are no shortcuts back to engagement once disengagement has stabilized. For those hoping for a sudden reversal, history offers little encouragement. Social norms rarely snap back to previous states. They evolve forward. The future of connection will not look like the past. It will reflect lessons learned during this period of withdrawal. It will be quieter, slower, and more selective. It will reward patience over performance. That future may disappoint those who thrived under high intensity dynamics. It may frustrate those who equated visibility with value, but it may also benefit those who were marginalized by noise and speed. Slower systems allow depth to matter again. Depth favors sincerity over spectacle. The danger moving forward is not disengagement itself, it is misinterpreting disengagement as an attack. When people feel attacked, they defend. Defense hardens positions. Hardened positions reduce flexibility. Flexibility is necessary for adaptation. Losing it makes systems brittle. The opportunity lies in reframing this moment as a recalibration rather than a collapse. Recalibration implies adjustment rather than loss. Adjustment requires effort, but it is within reach. Loss feels final. Finality discourages action. How this moment is framed will shape how people respond to it. For individuals navigating this environment, the most productive stance is agency without resentment. Agency means recognizing what you can control. Resentment means fixating on what you cannot. Resentment drains energy without producing change. Agency redirects energy towards stability and growth. Men who have chosen solitude are not obligated to justify that choice. Women seeking connection are not obligated to apologize for wanting it. The conflict arises when either side assumes entitlement rather than choice. Choice respects autonomy, entitlement resists feedback. The future belongs to systems that respect autonomy. This respect must be mutual. Mutual respect does not mean agreement on everything. It means acknowledging the legitimacy of different responses to shared conditions. When people feel respected, they become more open. Openness is the seed of connection. Without it, nothing grows. And it is also worth acknowledging that not everyone will adapt smoothly. Some will struggle, some will feel lost, some will cling to narratives that no longer fit. That is normal during transition. Support should focus on helping people build stable lives regardless of relational outcomes. Stability reduces desperation. Desperation distorts behavior. As stability increases, curiosity can return. Curiosity is the opposite of fear. Fear narrows focus. Curiosity expands it. A curious person asks how systems work rather than who to blame. That mindset is rare during upheaval, but it is invaluable. Over time, new norms will emerge. They will not be designed by committees or enforced by platforms. They will emerge organically from repeated interactions that work. What works spreads. What fails fades. This process is slow but reliable. The final truth is that walking away is not the end of the story, it is a chapter. Chapters close so others can open. Whether the next chapter is healthier depends on whether lessons are learned or ignored. Ignoring lessons guarantees repetition. Learning them creates alternatives. We are at a crossroads defined not by conflict, but by choice. Choice to adapt or entrench, choice to listen or dismiss, choice to build something new or cling to what no longer functions. No one can make these choices for others. They must be made individually, then reflected collectively. If there is one thing to carry forward from this discussion, it is this. Systems do not fail because people are bad. They fail because incentives drift out of alignment with human behavior. Realignment is possible, but only when reality is faced without hostility. I want to hear what you think about everything we covered in this video. Do you agree with the conclusions? Do you see this as a permanent shift or a transitional phase? Leave a comment on the video sharing your thoughts, because these conversations matter and they shape how people understand what comes next. And like the video, if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.